Now, this fourth phase has almost come to an end. There are still some aspects of it developing. But the fifth phase we are entering is the period of institutionalization and consolidation of the Muslim community. Because now, most American scholars and government officials have come to recognize that Islam is in the United States for good. It is not going to disappear. Muslims are here. And you have increasingly a large number of Americans, native-born Americans, who are Muslims. And most of the scholars and the White House recognize this because they now invite Muslims to have Eid celebration in the White House. That's a major development in the United States. And of course, America can also use that for political purposes in the Muslim world. It cuts both ways. You legitimize the Muslims as part of the American way, but at the same time you can turn around and tell the Muslim world, you see? And Clinton did that when he addressed the parliament in Jordan. And he told the Jordanian parliamentarians that we too hear the azan every day, and we too pray 5 times like you do. Meaning the American Muslims also pray like the Jordanians or the Arabs in the Middle East, because you do have American Muslims, they are citizens of America, but they share the same religion as those Middle Easterners or Muslims in the old world. That is part of the fifth phase. That what is now beginning to happen is that the Muslim presence in America is now evident, and you can develop a number of indices to measure this. One is the population growth. Now, most demographers and most national newspapers will tell you that there are at least 5 million Muslims in America. So this means to say that the Muslims are very much now part of the American cultural landscape. Second index is that Muslims are now creating schools, to the point that this big debate going on within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as to school vouchers is not only the concerns of very Orthodox Jews, very traditional Catholics, very traditional Protestants, but it's also an issue for Muslims, because homeschooling or private schools for their children becomes an issue for the Muslims. So you can see that there are now a number of issues that develop in the American body politic which are also of significance to the Muslim community. And the Muslims are now becoming part of that discourse in American society. And if you read the literature, scholarly literature, you'll begin to see increasingly inclusion of Muslims whenever they talk about the Christian, the Jewish, and the Muslim phenomena in American society. This is being done by scholars and by journalists, and of course by policymakers in the United States. Now, another index that is very interesting is the large number of mosques that are being constructed around the United States, to the point that you now have numerous mosques. There is not a single major American city today where you do not have a Muslim architectural presence in the form of a mosque. And in some of the big cities, you have many of these structures in place. So this is another interesting index by which to measure the cultural presence of a religious minority. And of course, this is not true only of the Muslims. This is true also of the Hindus and the Sikhs in America and the Buddhists. But since we are talking about Muslims, we can begin to see that the geography of religion in America would now, the geographers, those who write books on geography of religion, will suddenly devote certain pages to Muslims as part of the American cultural landscape. Another index that is manifesting itself, and I alluded to that with respect to campus life, is the fact that halalization is beginning to take place. Just like kosherization took place as Jews were beginning to be accepted. And now, of course, the Hindus and their vegetative diet will also beginning to be taken into account in American society. The same thing is becoming evident with regard to the Muslims, to the point that if you are flying on the airlines, you can tell them that you don't eat certain kind of food, and of course, they will try to find meals that accommodate your needs. And of course, the Muslims are now beginning to be taken seriously as part of the American cultural landscape through the creation of halal meat markets. And if you come from California, you have many of them. You come from Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, you come to New York, so many of them. So this is becoming very interesting phenomena. Now, like all groups who immigrated into the United States, scholars who are urban, folklorists, or urban anthropologists are also beginning to collect new data with regard to immigrant lives in American society. And of course, the presence of Muslim immigrants would be manifested not only in peddling, as we described earlier, but now increasingly you'll find Muslim taxi drivers and Muslims working in all walks of life. And of course, one of the phenomena would be jokes about the new kid on the block. And of course, you have on New York radio stations, sometimes they make jokes about the Muslim taxi drivers of New York City. You have many Pakistanis and others. I mean, you know, like, and some of them. So that is an index, you see, of the presence of the other group. You see, where you now begin to have members of the mainstream culture talking about groups that are just recently arrived or are finding their way within the culture. So you have in the fifth phase in the development, institutionalization, whether it is in the form of the mosque or the masajids, Islamic centers, whether it's in the form of halal stores, whether it's in the form of bookstores that specialize in Islamic books, and they go with the halal stores, in many parts of the country. And now you're beginning to see with the development of the internet in America, you have many websites that are set up by Muslims to show their presence in America. Jokingly, I always tell people that America is the big magnifying mirror, and everybody wants to be on that mirror to look big. So the reality is the websites, the internet becomes a very interesting mirror. And of course, the presence of the immigrant communities as well as the old established communities is in the net. And Muslim websites demonstrate that American Muslims are now part of the American internet web. And of course, teachers as well as scholars like us who write about these things do not only supplement our books and other scholarly sources with the net, but we also keep the old tradition of interviewing members of these communities so as to keep ourselves well posted with developments in their communities. One other point that needs to be emphasized also with regard to the institutionalization of Islam in America and the consolidation of the Muslim values in American society is the fact that all immigrants go through a period of assimilation and acceptance in the larger society. And of course, in America, you have 5 major institutions that are very key for groups that are immigrants and religions that are new, even though they are embraced by an increasing number of native-born Americans whose ancestors go back 200-300 years ago in the country. One good index by which you can see that these religions are gaining acceptance in the society is in these 5 institutions of American society. The school system, and of course the public school system becomes the big mirror. You find that there are a lot of Muslim kids who are doing very well, they have Muslim names, and some of them end up as valedictorians in some of these schools. And of course, this is an interesting development in American society. Other groups pass through this experience, Catholics, Jews, Italians, and all the other groups, they went through that process in America. So the same thing will happen to the Muslim kids. They will go through this experience with the teachers coming into the public school systems or going to private schools or whatever. They will go through this processing meal as other immigrant groups have gone through. And so the school system becomes very important. The universities also become very important. The second institutions that are very interesting in America would be the job market. And now you have Muslim institutions like CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, doing for the Muslims what the JDL did for the Jews when they were, and the Catholic peace and justice groups did for Catholics many decades ago. trying to make sure that these religious minorities were able to establish themselves in the American mainstream by taking litigious route. Because in America, one way of becoming part of the mainstream is to go to the courts. That's a legitimizer. Americans are the most litigious people on the planet. And of course, one way of making sure that you belong is to go to court. You see what I'm saying? So that becomes very important. So part of the institutionalization of Islam is Muslims having their day in court, pressing their rights as citizens in the United States, from the lowest courts to the Supreme Court. And this is happening. And of course, some of the employers, that's the third market, going to work in the marketplace, where Muslims now try to go to get jobs. And of course, you get in the internet and in the newspapers battlegrounds where Muslims are pressing for their rights in America, very much like the blacks in the United States were doing 30 years ago, 40 years ago with NAACP, fighting on behalf of the African Americans for their rights in the United States. So this phenomena is beginning to take place in America. It's part of the institutionalization and the consolidation of Islam in the United States. Another area which is very important, part of the 5 institutional basis for acceptance in American society, is the military. Now, of course, the Muslim immigrants who came fought in the World War I. Some of the Purple Heart winners in World War I were Muslims who came out of Europe. We told you about the Polish Muslims, the Southern European Muslims. Some of those Muslims and some of the Arab Muslims, they won Purple Hearts. They fought for America in World War I. In World War II, there were many Muslims who were decorated, who fought. Now, of course, in those days, many of those Muslims, like other American ethnic groups who migrated to the United States, changed their names because the dominant paradigm in America at that time was Anglo-conformity. And so Muslims in those days, just like Jews and other groups, changed their names so that they will look Anglo. So you may find a Muslim whose name is Muhammad Juma, and he called himself Michael Friday. So, I mean, because you see Michael Friday, that's a Muslim, Friday last name. I don't think many Anglo-Saxons carry names like Fridays. So, but you find many of those Muslims who change their names, you see, and your name is Muhammad, but, Americans tend to abbreviate names, call me Mo. So your name is Ali, call me Al. So, you have many of those things. But this is not peculiar to Muslims. It happens to other groups. Like the Greeks, they change their names. One way of showing that you arrive, when I give lectures in the universities, I say this, one way of showing that the Greeks have made it in American society is in the Stephanopoulos. In the old days, Stephanopoulos would not go to the White House with Stephanopoulos. He would go as Stevens, George Stevens. But you see, Vice President Agnew, they changed their names. They were Agnopoulos. So they take Anglo names, Agnew. So, the Muslims, this is an index of being accepted in the American society. Because as the groups begin to get accepted, they can revert back to their old names. And because they are now established, the military becomes a very important equalizer for immigrants because they go into the military, and the military is based on merit and ability to sacrifice for the homeland. And of course, now you find that there are thousands of Muslims in the US military. They didn't go there on draft because they're a voluntary army. They volunteered and they are in the military. So now you find that now the Pentagon people have accepted Muslim chaplains, and Muslim national organizations have been given the authority to recommend or nominate Muslims who are qualified to serve as chaplains, just like the Christian or the Jewish chaplains. This is part of the institutionalization process which is taking place in the United States. The last point I want to mention is the fact that in the United States, the academy also becomes a very important place, and you now have many of these Muslim students who came from the Muslim world to come and study in the United States. And of course, when many of those students came, especially from the Middle East, when they had money to send thousands of students, the Shah of Iran, you have certain universities that thrive in America, likely because of the monies that were spent by these countries. George Washington University really became a major university thanks to the money from the Middle Eastern students, because hundreds of them, if not thousands of them, came to study. That's millions of dollars. Georgetown University benefited immeasurably from this large number of students who came from the Muslim world, and they paid $30,000, $40,000 a year. That's a lot of money. I mean, if you have thousands of these students, you're talking about $40 million coming in. So that also became very interesting development in terms of institutionalization of Islam in America and the consolidation of the Muslim identity. So I will conclude by saying that if you look at the history of Islam in the United States, you will see that the 5 stages in the evolution of this community identify the periods in which Islam gradually came to the attention of American society, and this period goes before the founding of the Republic in 1776, and it continued to 1999. And of course, Muslims now are identified in almost all the states of the Union, but they are heavily concentrated in certain states, what are known as the big states of America: Texas, Los Angeles, California, New York, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Those are, you find them in Massachusetts, and these are the areas where you find the Muslims. And of course, there are Muslims in the smaller states, even in Hawaii, far away there in the Pacific, you find some small number of Muslims there, and even in Alaska, you have very small Muslims there, but they exist. So the Muslims are now part of the American experience. And I think the scholars who write about them in various outlets, either in the form of books dealing with American society, or in the form of books dealing with religions, or in the form of books dealing with ethnic groups in American society, are coming to appreciate this reality. Thank you very much. I hope I gave you enough. So you can, some of you I know wanted to raise your hand. You can ask any question.